Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be joining you virtually over from the East Coast of Florida. So welcome back from your lunch break. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the local governments are challenged with and looking at, but also opportunities across the state right now, because we've got a lot of programming and a lot of funding that's driving a lot of discussion, planning, and implementation of resiliency projects. And all of that is a good thing. There are a lot of drivers for that right now, and I'm going to discuss some of those. Next slide, please. So we know water impacts are coming, but I know Jennifer's probably going to talk a little bit about this also. We understand water impacts on our built environment and private property, but there are also impacts to the business community as well. Those impacts translate into economy for businesses, tax base for local governments, disruption of service for people that want to utilize those businesses. There are just many, many aspects. We've got tidal flooding, we've got rainfall-driven flooding. Obviously, water is a big impact that we're looking at. Next slide. And to underscore some of what, or kind of preface some of what Jane's going to be talking about, we're starting to see issues revolving around heat and planning for extreme heat and weather-related heat across the state of Florida. We even had legislation this year, Senate Bill 732, that dealt with heat-related illnesses. So I see this as being something that local governments are going to be starting to talk more about, also in terms of looking at the full range of resiliency-related strategies to climate impacts. Next slide, please. So Florida has been dealing with policy related to reductions of greenhouse gas emissions and climate for quite some time. Two notable pieces of legislation and requirements within state law. One, the peril of flood legislation requiring coastal communities within the coastal elements of their comprehensive plans to deal with the peril of flood. Many of those local governments, about 50% across the state, have come into compliance with these new requirements for comprehensive plans. Legislation was also enacted in 2011, allowing the option of local governments to designate adaptation action areas within the coastal element of their comprehensive plans. And then notably over the past 2 years, we've gotten legislation related to the funding aspect of resiliency, whether that money is coming to a local government, and we want to make sure that we're not reinforcing bad investment in property and making sure that those public funds are being put to good use with SLIP studies, sea level impact projection studies for state funded projects. And in the last 2 years, we've also had legislation related to the new Resilient Florida program, and we have rulemaking in process on that right now. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about that later in the presentation. Next slide. We also have local governments that are starting to legislate in this realm as well. And I know we'll see some of that in the discussion with our remaining panelists. This is just one example. More and more local governments are starting to deal with shoreline response. One of the issues that they're trying to capture with that is uniformity in shoreline response with property owners. Many of these ordinances to date have dealt with seawall and broader environmental and water quality components related to shoreline response. Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council right now has a model shoreline ordinance under development that will address living shorelines, hybrid structures, and seawalls through the use of an overlay district and design specifications on what those shorelines should ultimately look like and how they should operate to prevent property impacts, public infrastructure impacts, and right-of-way impacts from sea level rise and flooding. Next slide. So do local governments have to adapt? This is like a very burning legal policy, philosophical question that we are all kind of struggling with out there in the adaptation world related to local governments. And the answer to that, of course, putting on my lawyer hat, is a mixed yes and no. depending on the type of project and the type of impact and what the responsibilities of the local governments are. But these issues are falling to local governments because they control the land use, they control where people go, and they own and maintain a lot of infrastructure. And that infrastructure, people pay taxes to make sure that they can utilize that infrastructure. And they have an expectation that with rainfall or sea level rise or tidal flooding, that they'll be able to utilize that infrastructure for their benefit. Next slide. And so we do have more and more legal and policy debate about what adaptation for local governments looks like. A lot of that falls under the context of level of service. If a road or a stormwater system or a natural area is constantly being inundated, what does that mean in the context of a local government's ability or legal obligation that they own and maintain that infrastructure? Another issue that's kind of ripe for political and legal discussion is who pays for the maintenance of that level of service, especially in areas that are just going to become less and less habitable over time with the impacts of flooding and tidal and sea level rise based flooding. Another issue is takings, property level takings. There could be potentially liability for local governments that don't maintain access to private property. And we've seen some case law on that in Florida to date. There could also be liability amongst property owners for not adapting their shorelines and preventing floodwaters to trespass over their properties that could impact other private property owners or public infrastructure. And then finally, if a property owner complains and is not happy about the action that the local government is taking for an adaptation project, and they want to challenge that action or they want to oppose that action, the benefits to that property owner could potentially be factored into that determination on the value of a private property owner's outcome of that litigation. The one thing that is certain in all of this, there are not always clear answers in terms of the outcomes of these policy and legal discussions, but it is an area ripe for growth as we move from planning to actual implementation of adaptation projects and the funding of those projects. And we're seeing that litigation increase on both sides of the equation, trying to compel a local government or an entity to do something to respond to climate change, or we don't like what you're doing, we don't like the impact on us from a private property standpoint. Next slide. And then no good deed goes unpunished. As we move from the actual planning to the implementation side of this discussion, there are going to be people that may not necessarily want to be taxed or pay the debt service on bonds or pay impact fees through a stormwater utility or support bonding initiatives. And we've already started to see some challenges, some court challenges with the way that local governments are paying for some of these strategies. And one of the drivers of that is that there is now money available for local governments to actually implement these projects. And that programming, the Resilient Florida programming, requires cost share, requires a match. How do we come up with those dollars to actually pay the local government share of those adaptation projects? Next slide. So this is a little wordy, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but these are the basic tenets of the new Resilient Florida legislation, 380.093 in the Florida statutes. The program creates various elements that also include data collection and obligations on the part of the state to start planning for this. But the thing that is ripe for local governments are the granting programs for both planning and adaptation projects. And as I mentioned, when money is out there potentially for a 50% cost share, the discussion about what projects, what priorities, how to fund that cost share are really coming to the forefront of the resiliency discussion for local governments in Florida. On an annual basis now, we have a September 1st deadline for grant submittals, and that grant submittal deadline is driving some of that discussion. Next slide. This year, there were a couple of changes to the legislation. One, we have a definition of regionally significant assets as opposed to critical assets, which are owned and maintained by individual local governments. The other thing that's really important about the context of these assets is a lot of times we're focused in this discussion about gray infrastructure, pumps, buildings, things that, we think about in the traditional sense. But natural, cultural, historic resources, beaches, shorelines, wetlands, all of these are part of that natural system component of critical assets. Next slide. And so where's this heading? I'm going to wind up on this slide. I believe that the state is becoming more active in the resiliency world. How far that goes beyond water, flooding, and sea level rise right now is kind of an open question. Like I mentioned, we did see Senate Bill 732 this year that dealt with employer and employee health related issues for heat related illnesses. Local government response is going to become more, I believe, planned and moving into the implementation phase as there are state level commitments for funding and cost share and projects. I believe we're going to see more litigation on these issues as we move from the planning phase to the implementation phase. But right now, the one thing that we do know that is clear is we have no case law cases that are adversely decided against local governments for starting that planning process and undertaking the planning process. So planning is a good thing for local governments to start, and there's not liability associated with that activity. So I'll go ahead and end there. That's my contact information on the last slide. And I will go ahead and stop there and let the rest of our panelists make their presentations. Thank you.
Well, I'm thrilled this afternoon to have an opportunity to present what we're doing in Miami-Dade County, but also happy to see this panel has three brilliant women who are going to bracket what I say. Erin did a wonderful job introducing this subject. You're going to hear from my two associates I work with a lot after me. So here, a little short story on Miami-Dade County, how we approach many of these issues. Next slide. This is no surprise to you on the Southwest coast, how we're surrounded by water and Everglades bracketing our western boundary in the Atlantic and dealing with the specific structures, land structures that are very specific to our side of the peninsula. So the beaches are always a dominant feature and we have to manage them. But as you can see in the background, human society has intervened dramatically on the skyline of Miami, and that's part of what we have to deal with now and in the future. Next slide, please. So that geology that we live with is a lime rock forest foundation that under grids most of Dade County, a little bit of South Broward. Porous doesn't really allow you to do certain things along the coastline that many of you may read about, that the Dutch are doing, other folks. You just have heavy seawater moving forward with the pressure of rising seas will penetrate into our groundwater and force the groundwater table up, which affects our drainage. And of course, if it comes in far enough, it could threaten our drinking water. So this is some of the cards we were dealt. This lime rock is great when you mine it and make it into cement and make buildings. But it is and the good thing about it is it's stable. But it is what we have to deal with on our side of the peninsula. Next slide, please. So we have a long history of dealing with these issues of climate change, both from the standpoint, probably the longest with mitigation. We started inventorying greenhouse gases back actually before 2009 in the 1990s. But we also progressed joining international and national organizations, joining the regional compact, the Southeast Florida Regional Compact. I know regional efforts are underway also in the Southwest and other parts of the state. We had a particularly fruitful integration among our cities and county using the 100 Resilient Cities program. You'll see the release of the Resilient 305 strategy. I won't go in detail, but except for a few slides, but that is a broad definition of resilience, much broader than just climate. And we have specific studies underway, which we are implementing on adaptation and mitigation of greenhouse gases. And we have, as those of you on the Southwest Coast, we partner a lot with the Corps, South Florida Water Management District on much of this work. Next slide, please. So our office has grown as we've understood the threat and comprehensiveness of the situation. We have staff working in teams around mitigation to be part of the worldwide effort to reduce greenhouse gases, around adaptation, taking advantage of much of those funding opportunities that Erin talked about now from the state. We at the very beginning thought that communication was an equal component to our office. While all of us are tasked with doing that in our work, we wanted to elevate it to make it just as important as the content parts of our office. So something to think about as you think about offices in the county and cities. Biscayne Bay is our central park, and it is a intergovernmental priority. We're focused on it, and the commission and the mayor elevated it so we have a chief bay officer, Rella Begay, who works out of our office and focuses on this. And of course, your area has a wonderful national estuary program that we look to as one of the models. You'll hear from Jane, so I won't take away from her remarks, but we were the first county or city in the country to have an extreme heat officer. And we also, the mayor, Mayor Cava, looked across the board, not only the work we did, but at the planning activities that take place in all of our departments and outside of county government that affect our future. So she has assigned us a special person to deal with intergovernmental planning with its basis in resilience. Next slide, please. So here again, these are the covers of the reports. They're all online. So you can see them, and we're going to go through them quickly. Next slide, please. Biscayne Bay is one action item number 1, a resilience strategy. And again, these are items that many of the estuarine areas around the country, including over on Southwest, have taken up. And we are new to the game of getting organized, not new to the game of focusing on managing Biscayne Bay, because much of it is within Miami-Dade County. But we now have a watershed management board, and the legislature requested a state commission on Biscayne Bay to us. So we went from having no management boards to 2. So we'll continue to work. We have a lot of challenges to keep the seagrasses healthy and many other items dealing with the bay. Next slide, please. I talked about the regional effort. I just wanted to highlight this piece around sea level rise, because this has been, I think, the hallmark product of the South Florida Regional Climate Change Compact for over the last almost 15 years. We've been providing our community, all of our cities and counties, with a unified projection of sea level rise. So all of our actions that we take as a county and within our partners in the community are ultimately going to be about where on those projections are we going to fall? Where are those models going to take us? How are our actions going to be sufficient in reducing greenhouse gases and adapting? So it's the technical basis, but the important part of this is it's the uniform. This is the one that we use throughout our region. Next slide, please. This just recaps the regional effort, and you'll see the Regional Climate Action Plan is being updated now. You'll be able to watch that on our website. It's a very thorough document, probably I think now in its 3rd edition. Next slide, please. So going to the adaptation plan, it's our sea level rise strategy. Thinking out decades about how we are going to adapt to a rising sea. And we don't see any way around that. Even if we have dramatic global increases in greenhouse gas emissions, the sea level rise, probably a meter is baked in. So that'll affect a very flat terrain like Miami-Dade County, sitting on porous lime rock. So we've identified 5 strategies that are, we think, provide pathways forward. These are not the regulatory pieces. These are the broader ideas that we have to explore on the ground through pilot projects, working with our partners, cities, the 34 cities in the county. It does build on specific structures that are in place, like our expanding public transportation system, building transit-oriented development around those stations. It ends up that outcome of a coordinated transportation land use system is probably one of the most dramatic steps we can take to reduce greenhouse gases and protect and have an adaptation locational plan in place. I think that's really important, because sometimes people look for new efforts to underscore their work in adaptation and greenhouse gas reduction. But sometimes it's more important to make the things that you've already got going working and get the additional benefits of resilience planning that give you reduced greenhouse gases and adaptation strategies. Next slide, please. Here are those approaches. I don't want to go over my time, but you can see that they're structured around specific things, are being a landscape of canals. We know that's where we're going to have elevated water levels. Greenways and blueways, I think, is going to be a dramatic part of our location, what our landscape will look like. In 50 years, we plan to be here. We will not look the same. We cannot take a strategy that says we can keep the landscape intact in the status quo. That's not going to happen. Next slide, please. On the mitigation side, our climate action strategy is in 3 buckets, dealing with energy and buildings, land use and transportation, and water and waste activities. Next slide. We have those ambitious goals that many communities have of reaching net zero by 2050 and 50% reductions by 2030. We can make great strides. We can control what we do as a county. We're about 5% of the total emissions in our county are direct control of the county government. But all of us are challenged by the fact that we must work with the electric grid that is provided to us by our investor-owned utilities. We really need to partner with our investor-owned utilities to get dramatic changes in the way we produce electricity. If we don't do that, we can't get to net zero. It's just, we can't do that just with dealing with buildings and transportation. We've got to change the grid, especially as we say we're moving to electrification, which means there'll be even more demand for electric power. Next slide, please. This is a division of activities. You can see how transportation land use is so important to us with our airport and our port, as is our buildings. Next slide, please. Here, further elevation, and I guess I ran out of time. Guys, you go ahead. What happened, guys?
No, sorry, just hit the.
That's okay. I'm trying to finish, leave room for my partners here. I am at the end, so can you advance? I'm done. Yeah, that's a good one. Look, we have to worry about equity and health. You're going to hear a lot about health from Jane, but our economic development strategies to deal in underrepresented areas of neighborhoods of our community are a focus of all of our work. Next slide, please. And of course, we have to do it in a monolingual way, going back to all important aspects of communication. Next slide. Thank you, folks. Look forward to any questions.
So good afternoon. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Erin. Great lead into my presentation here today. I'm going to be really articulating why Miami-Dade County Mayor Daniela Levine Cava decided to create my position of a Chief Heat Officer and to, sorry, I'm just changing my spotlight because it's a little distracting. Anyway, next slide. Yes. So, so extreme heat, Southeast Florida has been working on both carbon mitigation for over 2 decades and sea level rise and increased flood risk for over 15 years. It's known internationally for its risks to sea level rise, flooding, and hurricanes, but heat hasn't really been on our radar as much until more recently. But it was really out of a series of focus groups and interviews that a group of community-based organizations had done in Miami-Dade County with our most vulnerable populations, asking them what were their top concerns related to sea level rise. And extreme heat was one of the top 2. The other one being displacement related to climate gentrification. So it is, and it's unlike flooding and hurricanes, extreme heat impacts human lives more than any other weather or climate related disaster, more than floods, forest fires, hurricanes, according to a preponderance of research, more than any of those combined. There are more heat related illnesses and deaths than all of those combined. And here in Florida, we have both high heat and humidity. We don't have temperatures like you might see in Arizona that go well over 100. We don't have those kind of temperatures, but with our higher humidity averaging 60–70% in the summertime, that gets us into a feels like or heat index temperature of well over 100. And that can really lead to an increase in heat related illnesses, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and even heat stroke, which can be fatal. And while we're all at risk to extreme heat, there are some groups of people who are both more sensitive or more exposed to heat. Young children, pregnant women, older adults, people on certain medications, people with pre-existing lung and heart disease are more sensitive and have a harder time regulating heat. Those that are more exposed day in and day out are our outdoor workers, and Florida has many outdoor workers. And for instance, agricultural workers are up to 35 times more likely to have a heat-related illness than your average person. And then those who are either without a home or have can't afford their air conditioning, or their air conditioning breaks and they can't afford to fix it in the summer, are also highly exposed. Next slide. Oh, and the good news, my last bullet on that is that heat-related illnesses and deaths are largely preventable. So there are things we can do. And here in Miami-Dade County, we've had a slightly over 2 degrees Fahrenheit average minimum temperature rise since 1985. Next slide. Next slide. And we're going to see a dramatic increase in days of heat indexes over 100 and 105. We've already seen a dramatic increase in days with a heat index above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But at 105, we're all vulnerable if we're exposed to heat for any length of time. And currently in Miami-Dade County, we have about 7 days a year where we have that. But by mid-century, with most greenhouse gas emission trajectories, we're looking at that as close to 3 months a year. The good news, unlike sea level rise, where you will continue to have sea level rise even as we control our greenhouse gas emissions, if we can fully control our greenhouse gas emissions, that will bring down our heat directly. There isn't as much of a compounding effect. Next slide. And it's not only climate change that is increasing heat in our cities, it is our urban development patterns. It includes the impervious pavements, the more porous, permeable ground cover we have, the more evaporation that can happen. The trees and vegetation can also contribute to evapotranspiration. Lighter, building materials can improve reflectivity, but all of the opposite of those things, more impervious, darker pavements, less trees, cause much higher heat loads, up to 17-degree land surface temperatures higher in certain areas of the city than others. And that is something we can also work to mitigate locally, directly. Next slide. And those urban development patterns are uneven and unequal. On the left slide, you see a map of Miami-Dade County with the census tracts by our median incomes, with the dark blues being our highest income, the whites being our lowest income area. And on the right is our percent urban tree canopy, the white being less than 10% tree canopy, and the dark green being over 40% tree canopy. Next. And it's not just the chronic heat that we have, it's the compound risk of a widespread and extended power outage that would most likely occur with any kind of hurricane, as we saw with Hurricane Irma, and we lost people in a nursing home, and since then have created some protection for at least the nursing home and assisted living facilities. But we need to look at where else we need backup power to protect our more vulnerable populations in the event of a power outage during a heat wave. Next. So I mentioned the risks at home. Keep going because we want to keep, we're running out of time. Keep going. Next. And at work, and just in Miami-Dade County alone, we have over 300,000 outdoor workers that are exposed to heat every day. This is going to have an economic impact as we have more high heat days, and our employers really need to provide more breaks with shaded or cool spots for people to cool down. Next. Or to change their work schedules. So we put together intergovernmental, interagency task force, 15 members that include members from our cities, our county, our Florida Department of Health, our National Weather Service, our research universities, our community organizations. And we've been involved over the last 6 months in a planning process, including a series of public workshops that we just wrapped up. You can see all the PowerPoint presentations on that website there, the Miami Foundation Extreme Heat. Next. And we created a toolkit, which I encourage you to take a look at because it has all the different types of interventions that people can do to both improve heat management and mitigating urban heat islands. Next. And those include areas of green infrastructure, our built environment, right-of-ways, et cetera, and how to inform and engage our communities to better prepare them for increasing heat exposure. Next. So over the last summer, we increased our awareness raising in partnership with our partner, the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, who has been involved in creating positions similar to mine throughout the world. And we next did a series of outreach with them with their resilience pod to inform about all climate disasters, including heat. Next. And created a series of posters in our 3 most spoken languages, Haitian Creole, Spanish, and English, in all our public facilities. Next. And some lesson plans in our parks. We worked with our National Weather Service on their daily hazard reports and social media campaign. Next. Worked with our parks on lesson plans. Next. And I mentioned our shelters have backup power, but they don't have the capacity to keep the shelters cool in the event of a power outage. So that's one of the biggest, if we're talking about infrastructure needs, it's really about making sure we have energy redundancy in key critical facilities. during a disaster. Next. you can keep going because we've got limited time. Next. We're also providing more training for our community emergency response team volunteers, our disaster volunteers, around heat, risk, and response, and providing them toolkits. Next. And looking at how we need to enhance the capacity at our cooling shelters as well. Next. In partnership with the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, we're working on a county-wide plan for turning our cooling centers into resilience hubs. Next. I'm going to keep going, and these are just, images. We're working with our local organizer. We count on outdoor worker policies. Unfortunately, the one at the state level didn't pass, so we're exploring what we could do at the county level and working with our parks and Department of Environmental Resource Management to improve coordination and accelerate the initiatives they already have underway. Million Trees Miami, our Adopt a Tree program, and other initiatives along our right-of-ways to enhance our tree canopy. Lots more to report, but you can go to both the MiamiDade.gov resilience newsletter for more information, and there's my email. I look forward to everyone's questions. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this session today. I appreciate the setup provided by all three presenters, and as you can see from the title, I was asked to speak specifically about the climate change compact here in Southeast Florida and some of the lessons that we've derived through our collaboration over the last 14 years. So the next slide, please. I expect that many already have a decent familiarity, so I won't belabor too much the overall history, but just to acknowledge that, we are the four Southeast counties. We came together with our first climate summit in 2009, but we formalized our collaboration in 2010. And it was with the general recognition that we were all working together working together simultaneously, but not in coordination on shared climate issues. We all had separate climate change task forces. We had separate vulnerability assessments. We had separate sea level rise projections, utilizing all the same information, but oftentimes with different results or results that could have been better aligned based upon the fact that we share so much in the way of transportation systems, watersheds, airsheds, shorelines, beaches, coral reefs. So many reasons for us to work together as a region. Next slide, please. And so the first convening that we held in 2009 was attended by about 150 individuals. We put it together in about 3 months. The major deliverable, though, coming from that was the presentation of a proposed compact, which was just a couple-page document that would detail how we would work together on our shared challenges of both climate mitigation and adaptation. It committed us to baselining our tools like our vulnerability assessments and the sea level rise projection that Jim showed earlier. Working together to develop a regional action plan. We are now working on iteration 3 of our regional climate action plan and hope to have that unveiled at this year's summit. We also committed to work together on shared energy and climate policy, and to reconvene every year with a compact summit where we could come together, kind of assess our progress and set the stage for the future. And I just want to say that over all the years, as we've seen major transitions with county administrations, with county commissions, with the staff that are involved with the compact experience has been substantially reinforced through these annual summits. And it provides, an opportunity to talk, to dialogue, to network, and to establish and reinforce those relationships with partners with whom we don't maybe have a chance to engage with the frequency that we would like. And it almost feels like a homecoming. I think that's kind of the sense that it should have when we do it well. And the last several years have been really, really rewarding, at least those where we were able to actually come together in person. So we're looking forward to that again in this next year. Next slide, please. And while the through the years, we've been able to execute on a number of the critical projects or deliverables to which we were committed under this original collaborative document, including those action plans, as I mentioned, the sea level rise projections. We've also worked together on regional emissions inventories, and those have been important because it reinforces not only what we think we know locally, but those trends are shared throughout the region. And so what that ends up doing is kind of bolstering both arguments for why certain investments are important, and that it's doubling or reinforcing not only local commitments, but those trends that we know that extend beyond our individual boundaries into the region. And really, you get the compounded effect, I think, of making those investments when you know that it's addressing both local and regional trends at an equivalent level. Next slide, please. It also reinforces the importance of many of the strategies that need to be implemented. And I want to share that clearly there's very strong political leadership, and we wouldn't be where we are if it weren't for the commitment of our elected leaders. But then we also have an immense and powerful team at the staff level that is charged with that implementation. And it's been kind of fluid. I think that's been important. We have a core group of individuals representing the 4 counties that have been important to sustaining that engagement, but we're supported by the Institute of Sustainable Communities that has provided project management or, considered part of that staff committee. We have municipal individuals who are engaged representing those communities. We have technical partners that come through FIU and the Nature Conservancy and others. And so while on paper things might look as if it's fairly insular in terms of the 4-county compact, fact is that there is this broad and rich and diverse team of individuals who contribute to the compact throughout the year and make massive contributions to the work products that have supported the compact. Next slide, please. Part of that is also represented in this slide, which is the demonstration of all of the additional external resources that have come to the compact over the years. And I'm sure it's not all inclusive, but this acknowledgement that we had very early on that we're trying to attract this support, but it's very difficult when a partner has to choose. Well, do I undertake this project with Palm Beach, or do I choose Broward this time, or is Monroe the partner? But if you can just partner with the compact, you get the one-time investment that benefits a much broader area. We set ourselves up better to be a recipient of services and technical support by serving as the compact. And I think that the partners too, who partner with us, whether it's through policy projects, technical resources, also can speak to the benefits of those investments being compounded by virtue of it being the compact partnership. And we're also able to bring that work to different levels of granularity as we oftentimes have implementation workshops that bring information to a very local level. So it's not all sitting at a very high level of the 4 counties either. Next slide, please. But one of the partnerships or investments that we've made in recent years that I think has really worked to elevate even further the work of our compact is that of the engagement with the business community. And I think we've also seen this model really take off in the Tampa Bay region with their recent report on economic resilience and their own convening with business leadership. And I think a lot of that was, I guess, inspired by some of the successes that we have had in South Florida. I didn't show clearly all of the initial work products or continuation of work products over the years. One that we really wanted to highlight here is that of the business case for resilience, which was jointly funded with the business community, the compact partners, monies that came in from the state, and has really demonstrated the economic return on investment that comes through strategic investments in infrastructure and those that bolster the economy. Next slide, please. I mentioned the work at the local level. I just think it's really important to underscore that while we are the 4 counties, we understand that so much of the planning actually occurs through dollars spent by municipalities and actions and initiatives that are executed through zoning and other very local tools and or stormwater management plans. And so it has been a key objective of the compact to hold these implementation workshops that are organized around key recommendations that are designed to bring our municipalities, our consultants that work with counties and cities and the tribal representatives, et cetera, all to the table to look at what implementation requires at very local levels. Next slide, please. And so some of the very specific lessons learned over the years, I've tried to highlight here. I think we all have different structures in terms of our compacts and our councils. We've found that it's been really important to think about how can you structure yourself to bring money in. You know, we're not a separate entity, the compact, so it does rely upon one of the partners to serve as a fiscal agent, and determining who is best able to do that, either because of procurement or legal or administrative process or staffing is really an important consideration. We also have learned over the years that while there might be some disagreement among even regional entities, that we feel quite strongly the requirement to operate within the sunshine. And that then means that many of the meetings that we would prefer to have over a phone call require in-person participation. And the larger your region, the more challenging that, and thinking about, well, how many people and who are the people that need to make up a quorum in order to be able to have the required compliance with sunshine requirements. So that's a really important part about why we're structured the way we are these days. Think about the scale of who needs to be at each conversation, the type of support and staffing that's required in order to be able to execute, which influences who comes to the table and how much information everybody needs to have at a certain point of time. But no matter the structure, it's really important to create that opportunity for broader engagement, hence why we have our implementation workshops and so forth, and really work to partner outside of the, the formalities of, the compact itself and its minimal structure. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so additional lessons just in terms of the staff committee and how we work together. We've all learned that, we all know that we're seeking efficiencies all the time. Be generous with your time, your expertise, your work products. I think we all share liberally and are gratified to be able to help one another. And I don't think that there's a strong sense of ownership or proprietary, senses as it comes with any of our projects. Maintain flexibility and understanding. We all look different in terms of how much staff we have, where we sit in the organization, the resources, our history, our priorities. So learning to be flexible, and not everybody implements the same way or moves at the same pace, and that's okay. It's great to have different leaders in different areas. Serve as a convener. Remember that the people at the table are not necessarily your most critical partners from day to day. And we have broad networks that we associate within our organization and communities. We found partners through Board of Rules and Appeals, through our procurement, through the county attorney's office and external partners. So finding ways to bring those folks together to help execute on priorities is really critical. Next slide, please. I know I'm running very short and I'm short on slides as well. And just in terms of the summit, because we are getting ready to host, and here we are at a summit also for ourselves, just some of the lessons that have been derived have been the importance of coming back with deliverables that remind us why we're working together and allow new leadership to recommit. Emphasizing the importance of the regional collaborations as part of the conversation, not just the topics. Why are we there together with the representation that we have? Integrating science always helps to take out some of the debate on some of the topics that might be there, and reinforces that this is information that is timely and relevant and coming from sources beyond staff. Engaging young people, we know that they're the stakeholders, not today and in the future, and they're going to be executing and implementing a lot of what we're putting into place, and making the summits relevant to the attendees with projects. So it's not all kind of, high level, it feels soft, not really quite sure what implementation looks like. Many of our public works people, for example, they want to see projects and they don't want to just talk about theory. Next slide, please. And then just acknowledging, as Jim represented, there's a whole other tier of implementation. Miami-Dade has the 305 strategy. In Broward, we help implement a regional resilience roundtable. We have our own projects. Palm Beach has their own 7, partner assessment focused on vulnerabilities. Monroe County has the County Roads Project, and it's whole other areas of the convening. So there is a lot that needs to be brought down in order to ensure implementation outside of the compact. And it's really important to think about what kind of structures can support implementation through those tiers of additional government that we have. And then finally, with the last slide, I would just invite everyone to join us in Southeast Florida. We'll be formally extending invites to the other regional collaboratives. Hope to bring all key partners to our own summit for additional conversation on December 8th and 9th, hosted in Broward County at the Fort Lauderdale Convention Center. Broward County, Fort Lauderdale Convention Center. Thanks very much and look forward to questions.
To your knowledge, does Collier County have a resilience office, and is Collier County part of a climate coalition group? I would just answer, I think these individuals are mostly from Southeast Florida. So as far as I understand, Collier County is part of the Southwest Florida Climate Compact, which we're going to be hearing an update about that after the break. So we will move on and let that speaker answer more about that. Jim, how has your management report differed from and or is compatible with the Biscayne Bay Aquatic Preserves Management Plan?
Great question. The Aquatic Preserve Plan, of course, is called for by state law. Responsible agency being the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. They have an office in the Bay. We have a strong aquatic preserve law. Erin could expound on the legal differences compared to others, but it's a fundamental structure to protect our bay and to stop filling the bay for uses that don't have a public purpose. And every management plan that builds will have that as a fundamental element.
All right, the next one is, how are you integrating urban green spaces, parks, medians to resiliency planning? How can it be integrated if it is not already?
I would say, just for myself, we're working on a countywide resilience plan that is principally focused on flood risk reduction, but also is intended to help address heat. So we will be looking at within that plan where we have hot spots and taking into account questions as well as, economics and community needs, and working to maximize green infrastructure as part of the flood mitigation strategies within this coordinated resilience plan, and looking to quantify the heat reduction benefits that can be derived through the green infrastructure in this coordinated manner.
The next one is, I was wondering if the panelists could comment about how managed retreat could help build resiliency in their communities. Anybody have any?
This is Jim. I mean, I understand it's a term in wide use, and especially in academic circles. I think it can lead to misconceptions to the public, so we don't focus on that. I think anybody who knows the history of Florida knows that people and development patterns have constantly been in motion because we're constantly managing water relative to the land. And that will be the fundamental way we deal with sea level rise in the future, is how we manage water, including sea level rise, relative to the land. And so, I don't, as I said in sort of brief remark, that we won't look the same. I don't think we will, but we don't plan to, retreat to Orlando. I think we know how to manage water and land, and we will get smarter and do it relative to these challenges.
How can we convince our governor not to sign the net metering legislation put forward by our legislature, effectively kneecapping rooftop solar? I don't know if anyone would like to answer that. I know it's more of a policy question.
I think I would just note that many have provided their statements of concern and opposition. Certainly, Broward County has weighed in heavily. I can't speak for others, but I won't, I guess, but I know that there are obviously many who have expressed concern, and that's, it moved through the legislature, and hopefully our governor is listening to other perspectives, and clearly that action is very inconsistent with many of the other needs that we have relating to energy, clean energy alternatives, as well as the value that distributed solar brings to those who are seeking to manage their economics. And it really closes the window or door for many of the options that are most critical to meeting our obligations, really global obligations in the next several years. And I don't know how we achieve all that we need to from a clean energy perspective, as well as an economics and equity perspective, without that tool. And I think that the argument about economics is completely inconsistent with the results of what this legislation will do.
Thank you. I think this next question is also very interesting because a lot of concerns center around, especially in the CHNP area, around rock mining. And it talks about, if one strategy is to build up on fill, where does that fill come from? And how do we ensure that it's not contributing to other problems? And it cites dredging in important benthic areas, dredging up or releasing buried chemicals and pollutants, or just terrestrial land mining for rock and sand. Any thoughts on that?
This is something that I've started to see come across my desk in the context of moving beyond public infrastructure planning and adaptation and harmonizing that with private property adaptation. It's come up in the development of the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council Model Shoreline Ordinance, and harmonizing design specifications for what you're going to do on the shoreline. But if you're not doing that in companion with how you're managing the dirt, so to speak, behind the shoreline, you're kind of missing a key element of that integration. It's also come up in the context of the Monroe County roads and tidal flooding project that we're working on, where you may be able to adapt the infrastructure and elevate the roads and manage the runoff from the roads, but that doesn't necessarily change the fact that there's going to be tidal inundation and flooding over people's backyards. And one thing I've started to look at as I get nitty-gritty diving into people's codes about this is we need to look at those requirements, those land development regulations, in companion with one another, and we're not. And local governments are, I feel like our codes and land development regulations are really antiquated with regard to on-site stormwater management, water quality, fill policy, and how to make all that work. So I actually appreciate this question, because I'm getting calls on this right now as a lawyer and practitioner kind of working in this field. I don't have any right answer or any one code that I can point you to and say, hey, these guys got it right in terms of integrating and harmonizing public and private property adaptation. But I can tell you that it's definitely something that I'm seeing more and more in the discussions on how to do that.
Thank you. What strategies are currently being implemented to narrow the gap with lower income communities and their climate resiliency?
So I think, one of the reasons our mayor, Daniela Levine Cava, decided to have a chief heat officer and create a plan specifically around this is that extreme heat is hitting those populations more than others. And so through, and I would add, some of the areas that this also crosses over with other adaptation and mitigation efforts is in both housing retrofits, and looking at how we can increase both the measures and flexibility of our weatherization programs and our low-income heating and cooling assistance programs from the Department of Energy, as well as with our multifamily housing options for retrofits and redevelopment in housing. Those are really critical to address energy burdens. Looking at policies for outdoor workers is critical. Looking at how we mitigate the urban heat islands, particularly in our lower income communities, not only with enhancing tree canopy, but cooler pavements, bus shelters, shade structures. We're looking at working with our transportation authority on how to place those shelters in the most vulnerable areas. So those are just some of the things that we're doing. There's so much more in terms of building capacity of our community volunteers and disaster response. We know that with shocks of a hurricane and a storm surge, have faced so many more challenges in recovery. So that is another piece that we're working with our community-based organizations very strongly on building their capacity and their resources.
So we see so many different questions here, more than unfortunately we have Q&A time for, a lot tied to land use and general, and we've heard a lot through this summit about how that can compound issues with regards to climate change impacts. Any thoughts about how you would recommend people go about trying to create complementary land uses that promote adaptation, resiliency, anything in your experience that is being done that you think is innovative on Southeast Florida side that would be useful for us over here to be thinking about as we continue to grow?
Well, this is Jennifer. What I would, sorry, kids, dang it. So what I would say is, in Broward anyway, we have established as part of our land use map a priority planning area, which delineates the areas of the county at increased risk of flooding with additional sea level rise. And as a result, when we have a land use proposal that is submitted for review, it is subject to a review for resilience, which includes considerations relating to groundwater table rise, future flood elevations, and new seawall requirements. And so we've been able to integrate into that process requirements for compliance with future conditions standards, even when it wasn't necessarily going to be applied through permitting, only because of the applicant's interest of being able to receive an endorsement from the resilience review as opposed to an opposition. So we haven't necessarily, it hasn't altered the ability for projects to advance, and that wasn't the intent, but our intent was to ensure development consistent with future conditions that are part of our 50-year planning horizon. So those are the examples that I have.
All right, I know we are going a little bit over, so I'm going to conclude with one kind of combo question. We have two here at the bottom that relate to each other about how much latitude does the state allow local communities to enact climate policy, and how did counties, municipalities on the Gulf Coast create sustainability and heat officers? How did this happen? Any recommendations that you have for local governments here about what their latitude is and how you were successful in being able to do this at the local level?
I don't want to speak on top of others, but I would note that at least in Broward County, as a charter county, we have particular authorities that relate to countywide authority on land use as well as on water quality protections. And so to the extent that we can tie our climate initiatives to land use or water resource, water quality considerations, we have quite a bit of authority that we've been able to employ And as I shared, we've been able to establish future condition standards, not only relating to land use, but also relating to finished floor elevation, seawall requirements, and requirements for drainage and surface water management systems. So I think that those are fairly significant. The major constraint that we have is on energy, and we are preempted at the local level and not being able to institute policies that conflict or would intend to address anything in energy code.
So I'll respond to the second half of that question, which really took citizen involvement and request for the staffing of first Jim's position, the Chief Resilience Officer, and then through citizen groups working in vulnerable communities to elevate the importance of addressing heat. That's really, it was really through that broad community voice that has resulted in Miami-Dade Office of Resilience growing every year since it was formed. Very strong growth. And it's really out of that every year around budget season, there is a strong oversight by a group of community-based organizations making sure that that support is there.